Hello, I'm Justin Wheeler, and welcome to Nonstop Nonprofit. On today's episode, I got the opportunity to talk to Jamie McDonald, CEO of Generosity and Chief Strategy Officer of GivingTuesday.org. With the U.S. election coming down to the wire and Giving Tuesday coming up fast, Jamie's emphasis on transformation struck a note that resonated across all we've endured in 2020. Jamie's advice might take some of our listeners by surprise. Considering that I normally hype digital expertise as essential to our sector's future, her argument that digital fluency is less important than starting where you are is powerful and accurate. Speaking of powerful, so is taking on the mantle of an entrepreneur. As a young nonprofiteer, it took a colleague of mine pointing out that I was an entrepreneur, a social good entrepreneur, for me to see the full depth of impact that nonprofit leaders have on the for-profit world. That realization changed the direction of my work and ultimately led me to champion the transformation in other nonprofits. In this conversation with Jamie, we talk nonprofit shop, the value of transformation in building your movement, separating successful strategies from digital fluency, the power of the collective to bring dreams to life, and what you need to start where you are. Let's dive in.
The best thing that we can do is just raise as much money as possible and then give it to the people around the world.
We set out to raise $1,000 to help this person, but we had no idea how to fundraise.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
That is unacceptable, and that is not the way to run a board.
Who is this girl, and what's the thought process when you're like, do I include a nickel?
And it snowballs like any peer-to-peer campaign. The more people that view this content, the further and further it grows.
The community raised $55 million in 2019.
The more nonprofits can give their donor base that experience of the impact that's being made on the ground level, there's nothing else you have to give someone. This is Nonstop Nonprofit. Hey listeners, thank you for joining this episode of the Nonstop Nonprofit Podcast. I am so excited to introduce our guest today, Jamie McDonald, the CEO of Generosity and Chief Strategy Officer of Giving Tuesday. Jamie, thanks for joining the episode.
Hey, Justin, it's so good to be with you.
Before we jump into a bunch of questions, I always like to start with your story. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do between Generosity and Giving Tuesday.
Yeah, so I'm a proud Philly girl, and particularly in this week of the election, feeling pretty darn good about the role Philadelphia is going to play in the future of our country. You know, I spent the first part of my career as an investment banker. I didn't come to the work that I do now kind of directly out of school. I grew up in a family that had some personal financial stresses, and I definitely kind of started my career thinking like financial stability first, but always had a real passion for working in the community from that platform. Baltimore is my home base now. I moved there after graduate school, and I really kind of immersed myself in the city. When I left my time, 17 years as an investment banker, I decided that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and my real interest was the impact space. So my first endeavor was not unlike Funraise, actually. I had a software company called GiveCore, which was one of the early crowdfunding, kind of local civic engagement platforms.
Awesome.
Had a heavy nonprofit focus, but also had projects that weren't nonprofits. It was in the living social, Groupon era, so very like local focus.
Okay.
Two-sided marketplace of, givers and nonprofits, and grew that and ultimately sold it to Network for Good in 2014. And then have spent the last, I guess now 6 years, working with entrepreneurs of all types, for-profit and nonprofit, but all of whom have a focus on the good they can do in the world from whatever perch they sit on. But I also, with Giving Tuesday, when I had GiveCore, I had launched the first large-scale community campaign for Giving Tuesday. We did a day on the second Giving Tuesday in 2013 where I kind of mobilized Baltimore, and we raised about $6 million. And that was back when Giving Tuesday wasn't a thing,
Wow.
the thing that it is now. But we saw the sort of the platform that Giving Tuesday as a concept created as a way to galvanize people around an idea on a day. And so I then with the Giving Tuesday team, advised them for a number of years on working with communities across the country. And we built, the community platform up to now there's 240 or so organized community campaigns in the US that take part in Giving Tuesday. I don't do that work anymore. I've got a colleague now who leads that, but I think a lot about how Giving Tuesday scales around the world. And really in that same vein, a lot of that kind of thinking, how a movement or an organization can scale is a lot of what I think about in my other work as well, which is how, people who are trying to do good, whether they're on a for-profit or a nonprofit platform, can mobilize a community around them that can help them scale their good work. So that's a medium length.
No, that's great. Thank you.
That's where my path to here.
It's actually brought up a bunch of new questions as a result. I want to go back to the scaling piece real quick and ask, as you work with both for-profit and nonprofit leaders and executives, do you find unique challenges in talking about scaling, specifically within the nonprofit space? Is that as important to nonprofit leaders as for-profit leaders in your experience, or dig into that a little bit for me, because that's super interesting.
It's a really good question. I mean, I have a different take on scale than you might hear from some people. So my view of scale is not how many people you have that connect with your movement, initiative, nonprofit, or company. My sort of perspective on scale is that it's about transformation. So it's how many people who connect with you are transformed by what you do. And therefore they feel motivated enough to share the word, right? To tell others about the power of their interaction with you. And so the easy example, and a lot of nonprofits will really get this, to sort of make that point really concrete, is if you think about, imagine if one of your kids had a rare disease, God forbid, right? That rare disease, maybe it's got 1,000 people in the whole world who have it. That is never a movement that will have scale, right? But the researchers who work on it, the parents who are advocating for a cure, the donors who give money to make the research possible, those actors in that movement or in that initiative or that nonprofit, if it's a nonprofit, their lives are transformed by the potential of what this work can accomplish, right? Yeah. So transformation is the linchpin there, not scale, because that movement will never have scale.
Yeah.
And so that's the pivot I try to get nonprofits in particular, but also for-profits. But nonprofits in particular, it's like if they can flip the switch and stop thinking like, how many social followers do I have, or how many donors do I have, and start thinking, how many people connect with me who can actually feel a sense that their life has been transformed by our work, whether it's because they feel they are making a difference in their community, or whether they feel directly connected to the cause for some reason. That's really how things scale, right?
Yeah,
and that's move without you.
Yeah. I love that. I love that definition, because it makes me think of several organizations that I work with who they don't need to scale to 100 million. They don't need to scale to 25 million to actually achieve the results that they're looking for to solve the problem that they're solving. And so looking at the transformation of the people you're working with, the benefactors that are on the other end, that transformation and defining that as scale is super interesting. Because it removes this pressure. I think a lot of organizations feel of like, if we don't get to 10 million in revenue, are we a meaningful nonprofit? Are we making meaningful impact? And so I love that concept. I think it's so strong, because you still need to grow. You still need to focus on building a good nonprofit, a good business. But the focus is on the transformation, which is super interesting. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Well, and there's one other really, I think, important connection point to that and leadership, for if it's, I call them all entrepreneurs. The idea of like executive director to me just seems like we somehow talk about nonprofit leaders as though they're less chief than, leaders of for-profits. So I just think of them as entrepreneurs. But I think that the other really pivotal aspect of taking a transformation stance rather than just a pure scale stance is then it helps you reframe the way you think about how you engage and interact with your supporters, because what you need to keep explaining to them, it transforms your storytelling, right? Because it's not about give because your gift will make a difference today kind of thing. It's
when you give, you get to shape the community you want to live in. You're transforming your life by being part of our community. And when leaders take that, approach, when they start to think in that mindset, it really shifts a lot of the other decisions that they make and also makes everyone on their team realize that our goal is not, 100 more disengaged, supporters who might give to us one time and walk away. Our goal is people who really believe that their investment in us can transform them.
And I love, looking at nonprofit leaders and executives and really individuals working in the nonprofit space as entrepreneurs, right? Because they are pioneering a path that so few people have taken. They're trying to solve, big problems, local problems, whatever it might be. And I remember that moment. I started a couple nonprofits before I started Funraise, and one of those organizations, I remember being on a subway in Seoul, South Korea, with one of our board members, and he told me, he's like, Justin, you're an entrepreneur, right? I was like, no, I helped start this nonprofit. I'm in the social good space. I'm not an entrepreneur, but I remember feeling a lot more power when we had that conversation, a lot more creative, a lot more, I don't know why, I don't know what it was, but I just remember that's really stuck with me. And so I appreciate that effort you put into as you're talking with nonprofits and EDs, looking at them as entrepreneurs and giving them that power to really create and innovate in their respective fields.
I mean, I think it's long overdue, honestly, for, nonprofit leaders to really assume that power. If you think about it, nonprofits and socially oriented entrepreneurs, because they don't always take a nonprofit structure, but social entrepreneurs are the ones that have taught us what it actually looks like to build a movement, right? It's not companies.
Yep.
There are certainly companies that think like movements and more companies that are adopting a movement frame. But the truth is, again, if you think in this transformation lens, then what you realize is that social entrepreneurs or people in the nonprofit sector are often the ones that are doing the things that are most transformative to society, but they don't hold that power in the same way that for-profit leaders do. And I think that when you sort of say, look, we're foundational to the future of society, the work I'm doing, it lets all these other companies have more consumers. It creates the ability for governments to sort of thrive within healthy societies. Like, that work is so fundamental. I think that sense of holding their own power is a really, really important difference that you see in nonprofit leaders who kind of find the traction of momentum and just aren't like slogging it out, 10% a year every year, right?
Yeah.
Versus the ones that just sort of never seem to really break through. That is definitely a hallmark characteristic that I've seen, across more pivotal leaders.
Are you seeing this change, especially with current events? Are you seeing the way nonprofits are working, like in their local communities, towards change? Are you seeing any impacts, or are you seeing this affect leaders with just recent, pandemic, the chaos of the election? How are you seeing this impact local nonprofits or leaders that you're working with? And
I mean, truthfully, I think we all have to acknowledge that no matter how strong a leader is, this has been a year like no other for us, for everybody, but particularly for those who serve others. In the sense that, it's been a stressful year just on all accounts, right? Everybody's carrying a lot of weight on their shoulders, no matter what we do. Life isn't normal. We are homebound often, where people are dealing with all kinds of personal, challenges, even if they haven't, been touched directly by illness. They have all the other dislocation that's happened this year. But at the same time, for many of them, if they're not directly in like the health, direct response, food, kind of, if they're not in one of those spaces as nonprofits, some have felt cowed to really sort of put themselves out there and say, we still matter right now, right? Like if you're an arts organization or your education or something like that, I think a lot of people have struggled with how to sort of stand tall and say, no, our work matters as much as it ever has, if not more, in this moment, even though we're not on the healthcare front line, or we're not on the food front line. We're on a different front line, right? And sort of owning that. At the same time, many of them, feel like they've had more demand on their services. So it's this triple challenge, I think, that a lot of nonprofit leaders are facing. And so I want to start just by acknowledging that. Yeah. At the same time, I think that what we have seen is that there are leaders who sort of say, we're going to use a year like this to experiment and do some different things, right? We're going to try something new. We're going to mobilize in a different way. We're going to tell different stories. And I think that, I hope, optimistically, I hope that some of the lessons that will have been learned this year, because people are going to be forced to be a little more creative, I hope that will actually carry the sector forward, into 2021 and beyond with, feeling like they've had a bit of a weight lifted off their shoulders, that they can try some different stuff, because you know what? In a year like this, all bets are off.
Totally.
Right?
For organizations, these smaller organizations that maybe are under-resourced, what do you think are the resources that they do need to succeed in an environment like today? Whether it's around their fundraising, the infrastructure, what would you advise nonprofits to really sort of focus in on to ensure that they succeed and survive through what we're going through?
I mean, I don't think it's all that much different than at other times, but I think you, of course, have to make sure that you're being relevant to the moment and authentic. Like, I think it's totally okay for nonprofits to be transparent about the challenges of a year like this one, and to use that honest discussion about how 2020 has challenged them, both from a service delivery standpoint, but also I think they can make the pivot to, it's also challenged us to think in new ways, to talk to you about new stories, to invite you into our work in ways we wouldn't have if just the world had just continued on,
Totally.
the way that it always had been.
Yeah. And we're seeing, what I'm seeing too with the data that I'm looking at across our customer base, it's the organizations that really adopted a more digital-centric fundraising approach. We saw those were the organizations that really fundraised through the uncertainty. And of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but we're seeing record online fundraising dollars, from Q2, really right around the time of the murder of George Floyd. We saw a huge spike in organizations rallying there, and it's sustained really through Q3. And so as you think about Giving Tuesday coming up and here in Q4 and end of year giving, do you think that Giving Tuesday will be its biggest year yet? Or do you feel like it maybe it's going to be impacted by, Giving Tuesday Now that happened shortly after? Or what are your thoughts around?
I don't think we think Giving Tuesday Now will be the thing that would have impact, but we never predict. So first of all, every year is its own unique year, and this year is the unique of unique years, right? I mean, so with the election uncertainty, with who knows what's going to happen these next few weeks, I just think we have absolutely no idea what is going to happen on Giving Tuesday. Not that we do any year, but I think we have even less idea this year. I think we could envision a couple of different scenarios. I think we certainly could envision people feeling like, this is the most important year ever to support organizations in need. I think we also could, have people be feeling like the energy that they may have put from whatever political, place they stood, the energy that they put into the election and may continue putting into the election over the next few weeks, that a pin will pop. I mean, it's so hard. It's just really, really hard to say. With all of that said, I want to comment on the point you just made about digital and then kind of connect it back to Giving Tuesday. Okay. So I agree with you to some extent. I do think, of course, we're in a digital age. The social sector was the last, and in a lot of ways is still such a laggard, but it's the last, sector of the economy to be revolutionized by digital. It's happening slowly, but, slower than other sectors because often of financial constraints and that sort of thing. But I also think that not being a super savvy digital organization is not a kiss of death for really effective supporter engagement and fundraising. Okay. Because, for example, if you think about what the mutual aid networks have done across the country this year, I mean, it's been unbelievable. Now, some of them are super savvy digitally, right? But many of them are next door groups, right? Or their, neighborhood churches where they'll have a message board and they'll say somebody needs this and who has it, right? And so I think it's a mistake to make any organization feel that if they're really small and they don't have, a 25-year-old digital native on their team who's really making them super cool on the internet, that they can't be really effective at supporter engagement and at building, support. I like to use support because I think it should be thought of as so much more than money.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I want to kind of address in terms of what you said. The connection to Giving Tuesday for me is that if you take that point, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, but if you take that point, then what that also means is that for Giving Tuesday, wherever an organization is, they can be successful. They just have to think about the mistake I think some organizations make is they say, oh, well, Giving Tuesday is a social media day and I've got 42 followers, but I'm going to try to run a social media online giving campaign.
Yeah.
Well, that's just not going to work, right?
Totally.
So they have to start where they are, right? They've got to recognize like, what is their strength? Where is their, their core sort of base of support? How do you reach them where they are? How do you engage them with compelling stories or give them opportunities to engage with you that are, that feel right to them? And some of that can be really analog. So, I'll give you just one very small example. It sort of straddles analog and digital, but in a lot of the small communities that we work with for Giving Tuesday, particularly in small towns, they literally create like old-fashioned give guides with a PDF.
Okay.
Right? Where they go to every nonprofit and they say, what do you need this year? And the nonprofits in their town will say, many of them will say, we need to raise $3,000 to have 20 more kids go through our program. But a lot of them will say, we need 3 hours of an accountant's time to help us with our 990, or we need 5 hours of a lawyer's time to help us write an employee handbook, or we need 4 new computers, or we need 100 pairs of socks for the people experiencing homelessness in our city or whatever, right? And literally this give guide has the list of every nonprofit. It has a little overview of them. It has all the stuff they need. And they get the whole community involved in trying to like cross everything off the list on the give guide, right?
That's awesome.
Super analog, right? It's not digital, but it works. And so my point in all of that is just to say, I don't want anybody listening to feel like they can't be successful whatever way they need to be for their organization on a day like Giving Tuesday.
Yeah.
You just have to resist the temptation to try to do it like everybody else.
Totally. I agree with that. I would add that I think digital is, a lot of times people confuse digital as a strategy, not a tactic. I think digital is a tactic. And I think, and it's a distribution channel, right? There are multiple distribution channels. The most important thing a nonprofit can do, in my opinion, is tell their story in a very compelling way, right? Because nonprofits are competing with products and other businesses. You're competing for disposable income, essentially. And your story has to be good. Your messaging has to be important. It has to resonate with, the end supporter who is thinking about buying, product A instead of making a donation. So I definitely agree that like the story, telling that story, getting your story out, and whether you decide to use digital distribution or analog distribution or any other sort of creative channel, that just becomes a tactic to, further get the word out. And of course, there are opportunities to accelerate, I think, fundraising under certain channels, but agree that it's not a kiss of death if you're not entirely digital or if you can't go digital. But the question I do have to there is, what holds a small nonprofit back or an organization working in the community from using digital? Is it the cost? Is it the expertise? What is it that holds someone back from at least, bringing it as a part of their tool in their tool belt?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is a little bit like, what holds you back from speaking a different language in a different country?
Fair enough. Yeah.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I think that a lot of us, maybe you grew up taking Spanish, but all of a sudden you land in Spain and you're like, up, right? Like it's hard to feel confident. And honestly, that lack of fluency comes across often. Like my kids tell me this, that for my age, I guess I'm reasonably comfortable on social media. It's not something I do a lot, but I do it when I have to. And what my daughter, the way she describes it is she says, you're conversational, but you're not fluent, right? And so I think that that's what holds a lot of nonprofits back, is that they worry that if they go into a channel where they're not fluent, that it actually doesn't help them. It might even hurt them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's true, but I think that that's the feeling. It's that same feeling about landing in a foreign country. And even if you grew up taking Spanish in school, like you just, all of a sudden you feel really awkward speaking that language.
Yeah.
That's why I really try to emphasize to sort of like start where you are. The other thing that for sure can really help is if you have a great story. And so I'll link back to your story concept with one of the things I teach in my workshops. And again, this is true for me, nonprofit, for-profit, it really doesn't matter, is I think that iconic stories are the thing, not just stories. Right. So I think, and what that means in my frame is, I think that nonprofits and for-profits need each year 1 or 2 stories that are the stories they tell all year long. So instead of trying to tell 100 stories of 100 different people that have benefited from what you've done, because we're in such a saturated media age, right? For anything, there was a rule of thumb years ago when I was in graduate school that was like, if, it took 7 touches before a marketing message broke through, today I would imagine it takes 27 touches, right? And so if you think about it, if you're a small organization or a large organization and you're trying to tell 20 different stories about your impact, my guess is none of them land.
Yep.
Right. So, when I do workshops, the example I give is, if you think about Starbucks in October, what do you think about?
Pumpkin lattes.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not that Starbucks doesn't want you to come in and get your double macchiato.
Yeah.
It's that they need a breakthrough message that's going to make you think about Starbucks.
Yeah.
And so if you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, you need the equivalent of your pumpkin spice latte.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You need that story that you're so sick of talking about because you've told the story of Susie who, ended up going to art school and becoming a world famous artist because she went to your after school art program in 3rd grade. You need to tell that story all the time. Now you can tell Susie's story from lots of different angles. You can talk about it from her teacher in 3rd grade. You can talk about it from her mom. You can, right? But the story of Susie becomes, what's the progressive lady? Flo.
Okay.
It's like Flo on the progressive ads. You've seen all different takes on Flo, right?
Yeah.
But she is the iconic story in essence, the iconic figure in that particular instance. They want you you need to connect something with your organization.
Yeah.
And I know that it's like hard for nonprofits to think that way, but an iconic story can really be a breakthrough when a nonprofit gets their head around that as an idea, that they don't have to tell 100 stories. Because again, it's about transformation. It's not about scale. Totally. So one amazing story of transformation that can make people feel like an investment in your nonprofit can result in this kind of transformation. And therefore, when that person is transformed, I am transformed because my community is different.
Yep. That's
the pivot.
Yeah. I think that this translates really nicely as well to the way you talk about impact to your supporters. You have this iconic story that you share over and over again, which becomes a big part of your brand. But also I think the mistake a lot of nonprofits make is they tell us that they want to save 10,000 people, right? And we don't have like the emotional bank to understand what 10,000 lives saved really means. And so we saw this when I was at Liberty North Korea. We actually saw this play out where we have this like robust chapter program, universities and high schools all across the nation. And our messaging used to be, hey, like your goal this year, chapter network is to raise enough funds to rescue 100 refugees, right? Mm-hmm. And then we started to change the model and said, hey, school, you're responsible for one rescue, one person. Like that's it. Like this year, focus on one rescue. And when we pivoted to that sort of messaging, the growth in the overall fundraising skyrocketed. because people had connection to, one life, one individual. And I think that resonates in stop telling 100 stories, tell one really powerful story, make it iconic, make it what people, when they think of your organization, this is what they think about. All the other things will fall into place. So I love that concept. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I'll give you another, I think about that same idea as a layer of what I'm talking about with the iconic story a lot. But the process of getting there, I call, again, like I do so many workshops. I'm sorry if I but I call this landing the helicopter.
Okay.
Right. So if you imagine you're in a disaster zone flying over a hurricane zone, right? And all you can see for miles in that helicopter is water as far as the eye can see. But, you come down to 5,000 feet and now you can start to see some patches of land. You can see some houses sprouting up. And imagine if when you're up at that high thing, somebody's saying to you, go help. When you're up at the high point in the helicopter and you're like, geez, you should just keep flying because what could I possibly do to make a difference right now?
Yeah.
But the helicopter starts to descend, you get down to 1,000 feet. Now you can actually start to see some movement on the ground. You get to 500 feet. Now you can see a family with their backpack on and they're dragging the dog along and they've got their kid walking next to them. And you land on the ground and you get out of the helicopter and somebody says, I need, and you say, I'm here to help. Right? So it's like nonprofits so often talk from the helicopter instead of coming down and down and down to the place where somebody can find their point of connection.
Totally.
That's the transformation that you went through. It's sort of like you jumped right to the end. It sounds like you guys were really smart, but for a lot of people, what I find is that they've got to sort of sequence themselves down through the descent down to the ground and really recognize that. And then that links to the iconic story, right? Because now you have your iconic story and you can tell it over and over again.
Yep.
So yes, we are in 100% agreement about that.
Yeah, no, I love that concept. That's a great analogy. So you work obviously with a lot of leaders in the nonprofit space, executive directors. This might be an odd question. So companies like Funraise, who sell technology, who help organizations, modernize their fundraising, but also just help steward their donors and cultivate them. What can we do better to serve the type of clients that you work with, the type of leaders you're interacting with daily? What can companies like Funraise and others in our space do better to support the nonprofit community?
It's a really good question. I think that one of the most critical things from my perspective is I think we do a lot of, and I did this too. So I say this from a place of my own learning because I had a software company that was working with a lot of nonprofit leaders. I think that we focus more on how they do what they do than who they are as leaders and why they do what they do. And so I think that's one pivot that we could make. The people that are sort of the providers of services and tools, that if you could take, I think the reason that a lot of people bring me in is for some of the stuff we're talking about today.
Right.
But the truth is your business would be better if you helped more of them to understand that they can lead differently, that they can tell stories differently, that they can be more transformational, even if in the short run, it means less online dollars flowing through your platform.
Right.
What it can mean in the long run is sustainable. Because look, the other thing, we haven't talked about this, but I'll bring it back to the point I was just about to make. The other thing this year is certainly showing us is a nonprofit that is not stable in a period like this is going away. I don't know what the estimates are now. I've seen different estimates through this year about what the fallout will be in terms of nonprofit closing.
Yeah.
And it's not that their work isn't important. It's that they've never sort of made that more important connection to sort of leadership and transformation. And they make it about doing and fundraising.
Yeah.
And doing and fundraising should be the enablers of leadership and transformation. But I think those are often sort of put to the side. So I would say that that's one thing to really think about. I think the other thing is to recognize, and this has been borne out by a lot of Giving Tuesday research, people are more inclined to give money when they're asked to do things other than give money. And so, if you say to people, we value you as a person who believes in the importance of our work. And there are all these ways that you can be supportive. You can give us skills, time, advocacy, and money, and just cheering and belief, right?
Yeah.
Those people who feel valued in all those ways are much more likely to give money.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true with millennials who are so sensitive to being like human wallets, right?
Right.
So I think that's one thing that you guys could really think about, how to message more effectively, more genuinely provide tools for, do more coaching around just like the wellness of and health and mental well-being of, leaders in the sector in difficult times. I mean, I think there's a lot of that kind of thing that could go a long way.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's super helpful. It made me think about the idea of the way that you invite supporters to engage and to be a part of your organization. It's so true. If you think about, a cliche example, but Nike, right? When people buy Nikes, you feel like you're not buying shoes. You feel like you're buying into a dream that you can be X, Y, or Z, right? The way that they market, the way they tell their story, you can be an Olympian if you wear Nike shoes, right? And I think with like the sort of connection point here with nonprofit organizations is there has to be this belief, especially today, I think, that when you get involved with this organization, when you donate your time, your resources, your money, whatever it might be, you're actually making an impact. You're actually a part of what the organization says it's doing to try to end or whatever the problem might be. So I think that it's not just about volunteering, or it's not just about giving your time and resources. It's actually understanding that the organization you're supporting is equipped and can make the change that it's mandated to make. And I think going back to like the storytelling and the iconic sort of, success story that you tell, I think that plays into it. It's what I say. See, organizations struggle to tell. We call it your theory of change. Organizations really struggle, I think, to make that the connection of like, we exist to solve this problem. Here's how we're doing it. I don't know if you see that with the organizations and clients that you work with, but I see that across the board as a problem that could be addressed in a better way so that more people stick around and give, right? You have a terrible retention problem with donors across the board. And I think part of that goes back to the way impact is being communicated and proven.
I think that's 100% right. Demonstrating impact is definitely one thread. I think there's a number of other threads that are also really critical to retaining supporters. And, they're connected to this transformation concept. Like, my definition of a movement is a collective surge of energy toward the possibility of a different future. That's my definition.
Okay.
And so think about the components of that. And that's because I've been involved with a lot of movements, right?
Yeah.
And again, and I consider some for-profits movement builders, right? They're really good at Nike. That example you gave in some ways is that idea. So the collective part of it's important. So one thing that I think a lot of effective organizations do really well is certainly not just show impact, but shows that together our supporters are doing this. They're making you feel like you're part of something bigger than just your individual action. So the collective part is important. The surge idea, to me, like that idea that when you join us in this, we're like surging together. We're building momentum. We're making progress, right?
Yep.
That this is like, and then a collective surge of energy. So the energy piece of it, to me, is like that sense that, I mean, we all know it when we feel it, like those places that are just like electric, right? They have that thing that's hard to describe, but like if you can, and you see it in certain leaders who just, they so passionately believe that their energy just like comes through, right? And then the final piece about it is the possibility of a different future. I think the one tricky part of impact is some of the work that nonprofits do is a bet on the future. And so that's why I like this concept of the possibility of a different future, that we're I like your Nike example because it makes that point completely, right? Yeah. They're not promising you're going to become an Olympic athlete. They're saying if you wear our shoes, there's a possibility you're going to be better at what you do, right?
Yeah.
There's a possibility of a different future. So, so I think about all of the different points in that arc, that statement for me. If a leader of a nonprofit is really thinking through each of those steps of building a movement: collective, surge, energy, possibility, different future. If they think about those 5 things, then impact is in there. Impact is part of that, but it's only one thread of the button on your sweater, right? Where what I'm trying to do is say you need 5 or 6 loops through that button if you're really going to bind people to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that. That is, I think that's the best I've ever heard this concept explained. I really appreciate that perspective. And I love the idea of the possibility of a better future. I think that's right. Like, a lot of times nonprofits are just making bets on whether or not they're going to change the future. It's more transparent to talk about it from the possibility of a different future. Jamie, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much. We've already spent an hour talking, and I'm super excited to get this out to our listeners. So thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. This podcast is brought to you by your friends at Funraise, nonprofit fundraising software built by nonprofit people. If you'd like to continue the conversation, find me on LinkedIn or text me at 562-242-8160. And don't forget to get your next episode the second it hits the internets. Go to nonstopnonprofitpodcast.com and sign up for email notifications today. See you next time.